castle, a stone mass, a symbol of power and invincibility. Inside, it would seem, complete security from external threats. But is this really the case? Answer honestly. Would you be able to live in this stone box for at least a week without going crazy from cold, hunger, stench, and constant fear? We are used to the image of a medieval castle as the epicenter of romance, chivalrous exploits, and sumptuous feasts. However, behind these majestic walls, there was a reality that would change your idea of survival. We won't talk about heroes on the walls or sieges, as much as already known about them. We will immerse ourselves in the invisible, everyday struggle for life that unfolded inside these impregnable citadels. How did people manage not to freeze in the winter, not to die of diseases in the summer, and not to go crazy from the constant dampness and stench? This is a real mystery. Get ready to find out why the castle was not only a fortress, but also an ice trap, an incubator for epidemics, and why its inhabitants constantly smelled of feces. Do you want to know all the shocking details? Watch this video to the end. In the 21st century, we are familiar with quarantine and isolation. But imagine that in the Middle Ages, when an epidemic broke out, the castle, designed to protect, turned into a trap for the sick. Getting out of it without infecting others or getting infected yourself was almost impossible. It was a prison made of stone, where an invisible disease became as much an enemy as a besieging army. When there was an outbreak of plague, smallpox, dysentery, or typhoid in the castle or surrounding area, its gates could be closed tightly, turning it into a kind of stone infirmary. The goal was twofold: to prevent the disease from spreading outside the castle and, more importantly, to prevent the population from fleeing, which could spread the infection further. The lord or commandant of the castle, having absolute power, could issue an order for complete isolation. This order, often accompanied by strict enforcement, meant that no one could enter or leave, even if the same epidemic was raging outside the walls. For those who found themselves inside, it was tantamount to a sentence. Imagine this psychological burden. You see how your neighbors, friends, family members get sick and die, and there is no way to get out of this hell. Records from that time, though sparse, hint at the disastrous consequences of such isolations. Inside the castle, where people lived crowded and hygiene was at a primitive level, the disease spread at a terrifying rate. Cramped quarters, shared sleeping places, no running water for regular washing, and widespread unsanitary conditions created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of any infection. For example, in 1348-1349, during the Black Death, many castles, although not officially closed for quarantine in our understanding, became centers of infection, as people sought refuge in them from the plague, bringing it with them. Wentworth Woodhouse, a large estate with fortifications, could be one example where mass death from disease was more likely than from an enemy's sword. Without knowledge of microbes and effective drugs, the only cure was to heal and wait for the disease to mow down the weakest. Medieval healers might offer bloodletting or herbal infusions, but their effectiveness against the plague was negligible. The dead were often buried directly inside the castle walls or in a very limited space behind them, if it was not possible to remove the bodies. This led to contamination of groundwater that could be used for drinking, and to the spread of infection through insects and rodents attracted by the bodies. The lack of adequate sanitation protocols, such as incineration of contaminated items or isolation of patients in separate ventilated areas, exacerbated the situation. This, of course, further worsened the unsanitary conditions and contributed to the further spread of the infection. This practice shows the brutality of medieval logic, protecting society at the cost of the lives of those who are trapped. This was not humane isolation, but a necessary survival measure for the surrounding territories. A castle that was supposed to be a shelter became a place of death, where the only hope was good health and good luck. Imagine, you are locked in a stone cage with dozens or even hundreds of sick people, and the only way out is to wait for the plague to finish its work. Under these conditions, each breath could be the last, and each new cough a sign of the approaching end. Morale plummeted, panic spread, and people often became desperate. Surviving such a hell was a real feat, depending more on luck than on the strength of the walls. It was far more terrifying than any siege, But if not the disease, then what else could literally eat the inhabitants of the castle from the inside, making their life unbearable? The answer will shock you. If you think that life in a medieval castle was dedicated only to defending against enemies, you are mistaken. Every inhabitant, from lord to servant, waged a constant, grueling war with an invisible army of parasites. Fleas, lice, rats, bedbugs, and mice were not just unpleasant additions to everyday life. They were a real threat to health, food supplies, and even the mental state. Fleas and lice were everywhere. They lived in straw mattresses, in clothes and fur linings, in hair, even in the crevices of wooden floors and furniture. Constant itching was the norm, and people itched freely in any situation, even at official receptions. This led to skin infections, ulcers, and suppurations that could be fatal if left untreated. Constant scratching caused damage to the skin, creating an open gateway for bacterial infections. Medieval doctors often confused the symptoms of typhus with other fevers, making treatment impossible. Moreover, fleas carried bubonic plague and lice typhus. An outbreak of these diseases in the castle, with its overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, could be catastrophic. Castle records from the Tower of London or Windsor Castle indirectly indicate periods of mass diseases, which could well be associated with parasites. Rats and mice were the real owners of the castle after dusk. They penetrated barns, storerooms, kitchens, destroying precious supplies of grain, cheese, dried meat. Their presence meant a constant struggle for food. What people didn't eat, rodents ate. Under siege, when every morsel of food counted, rat infestations could doom the garrison to starvation. Moreover, rats were the main carriers of the plague flea, which made them living death machines. The methods of control were primitive. Cats, which often carried fleas themselves. Primitive traps, and of course, dogs that were set on rodents. But it was impossible to get rid of them completely. Some historians claim that in especially large castles, the number of rats could exceed the number of people, creating a constant, hidden threat. Bedbugs lurked in the cracks of the walls, in the straw beds and furniture, making the night's sleep a living hell. Their bites not only caused wild itching, but also led to insomnia, exhaustion, and nervous breakdown. Constant lack of sleep and discomfort negatively affected the combat capability of soldiers and the general condition of the inhabitants. Historical records sometimes mention the nocturnal suffering of the inhabitants, which could well be associated with these blood-sucking creatures. Some texts even describe how people preferred to sleep sitting or standing up to avoid contact with bedbugs, or tried to smoke herbs to scare them away. This invisible war with parasites was a constant part of life. It required constant effort, but rarely brought complete victory. Imagine, you are a lord, owner of a powerful castle, and your nights are spent fighting lice and bedbugs while rats destroy your winter supplies. It was a humiliating but unavoidable aspect of medieval survival. Life in the castle was not so much a chivalrous romance, but a constant struggle for cleanliness and health in an environment where these concepts were completely different than today. How did they feed when their supplies were constantly threatened? And how was the food stored so that it would not become a breeding ground for these small armies? We'll talk about this later. When it comes to food in the castle, we imagine feasts, bursting tables, and abundance of meat and wine. But what happened when the castle was under siege? During this critical period, when external supplies were cut off and the enemy was waiting outside, supplies were dwindling before our eyes and the inhabitants were forced to resort to extreme and sometimes shocking survival methods, turning the castle into an arena of gastronomic extremism. It was a life and death struggle where everyone could become both a hunter and a victim of their own desperate decisions. First of all, everything that could be eaten but was not part of the main strategic reserve was eaten. First, all the available livestock, cows, sheep, pigs, whose slaughter provided at least some amount of meat before they themselves died of starvation or disease. Then it was the horses' turn, including the knight's warhorses. This was not only a loss of a valuable resource, but also a deep humiliation for the noble warriors, for whom their horse was an extension of their own dignity and fighting power. Imagine, your trusty steed, a status symbol, turns into food. After that, dogs and cats were used, the very animals that were supposed to fight rodents. The loss of pets was not only a loss of food, but also a strong psychological blow, as they were often part of the family and, in a sense, protectors. Records of such tragic events are found in the descriptions of long sieges, when hunger drove people to the extreme degree of despair. When the animals ended, a real nightmare began, saturated with hopelessness. Sources indicate that people could eat rats and mice, and this, as we know, could be deadly because of the diseases that these rodents carried, for example, the plague. In addition to the risk of infection, rodent meat was extremely scarce and did not provide enough nutritional value to maintain strength. Vchodslaw leather was used. Old leather belts, bags, shoes, even pieces of armor could be welded together to extract some gelatinous mass from them. It was extremely difficult for digestion and ineffective in terms of satiety, but in conditions of complete hunger, people went to any lengths, trying to deceive the stomach with something. A powder made from crushed bones mixed with water could also be used as a kind of broth. Desperate times called for desperate measures, bordering on insanity. Some chroniclers mention cases where people ate moss and lichens growing on wet stone walls, grass that made its way into the courtyard, or even sawdust mixed with water to create at least some semblance of food. Some garrisons in extreme exhaustion tried to dig up plant roots or look for worms in the ground. In extreme cases, when the siege lasted for a very long time, there is grim evidence of cannibalism, although this, of course, was an extreme and taboo phenomenon that was preferred not to talk about. For example, during the siege of Oxford in 1142, supporters of the Empress Matilda were so exhausted by starvation that they were forced to flee, many of them dying on the way from exhaustion. The story of the siege of Canterbury Castle in 1215 also speaks of extreme hunger, forcing the defenders to eat something completely inedible. Events such as the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, during which the garrison suffered an incredible famine until King John released them with food, demonstrate how easily the castle could turn into a hunger trap. The besiegers' strategy often consisted precisely in starving the defenders, knowing that sooner or later supplies would run out and the people would do anything to survive. These facts about gastronomic extremism show how thin the line between life and death was in a medieval castle. Survival often depended not on bravery, but on how long supplies could last, and on ingenuity in finding new, however disgusting, sources of food. What if there was no water? How did the inhabitants cope with thirst when the well was poisoned and it didn't rain? The answer to this question may seem absurd, but it was part of their survival strategy. Cetos next. Water is the absolute foundation of life, without which a person can only survive for a few days. And when the castle was under siege, or just its main water sources dried up due to drought, a real thirst for death began. The problem of access to clean drinking water was one of the most acute challenges facing the inhabitants of the castle, and the ways to solve it were sometimes incredibly desperate, dangerous, and even deadly. The ideal option for any castle was a deep well located directly inside the castle walls, such as in Dover Castle, where the well reached an impressive depth of more than 80 meters. This gave the garrison and residents independence from external water supplies, which could easily be cut off by the enemy. However, even such a well could be poisoned by the enemy if they had enough time and money to dump animal corpses, human waste, or toxic substances into it. If a well or water source was located outside the castle walls, it became a prime target for the besiegers, who sought to capture, destroy, or pollute it in order to deprive the defenders of a vital resource. What was left when the wells dried up or were inaccessible? Rainwater collection tanks. They were provided in every large castle and were underground or above-ground reservoirs, where rainwater was collected from the roofs through gutters. But their capacity was limited, especially during long sieges or dry periods. In addition, the quality of this water left much to be desired, especially if the roofs were contaminated with bird droppings, dust, or smoke from fires. Such water, without undergoing any purification, could easily become a source of dysentery, typhoid, and other intestinal infections that mowed down people as well as enemy arrows. When even these meager sources of water were exhausted, desperate, almost suicidal measures had to be resorted to. People could drink water from the moat surrounding the castle, even if it was heavily contaminated with sewage, animal corpses, garbage, and rotting organic debris. Historical evidence suggests that during long sieges, such as the Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, the defenders suffered not only from hunger, but also from unbearable thirst. Water from the moat, full of rot and debris, was the only option, but it led to massive diseases and deaths, weakening the garrison from within. In rare and particularly significant cases, besieged castles could use complex water supply tunnels laid deep underground to remote hidden sources. These were real engineering marvels that required a lot of effort and money, such as at Canterbury Castle, where a similar system may have existed. But even these tunnels could be intercepted, blocked, or collapsed by the enemy, making them a highly unreliable solution in the long run. Thus, thirst was a constant and deadly companion of life in the castle, especially during the siege. It could break the will of the defenders faster than starvation or direct military conflict. The lack of drinking water meant not only suffering from thirst, but also the inability to maintain basic hygiene, which worsened unsanitary conditions, contributed to the spread of diseases and reduced morale. It was a vicious cycle of survival, where one thing pulled the other, turning the castle from a shelter into a deadly trap. But if the external threats were so obvious and the internal ones so deadly, how could the castle even function as a community without turning into chaos? The answer lies in the strict hierarchy and daily schedule that made life possible. Do you want to know how this stone anthill was organized? See more. A medieval castle was not just a collection of walls and towers, but a complex living organism in which each person had his own strictly defined place and role. Survival in this stone anthill was impossible without a rigid hierarchy and strict adherence to a daily schedule that organized all life from dawn to dusk. This system was so well-functioning that it resembled a well-oiled mechanism where each gear knew its purpose and place. At the head of this pyramid was the lord or commandant of the castle, whose word was absolute law. His power was unquestionable, and his decisions were final. Under him were his family, knights, and then a large garrison, soldiers, archers, and spearmen, the main defensive force. Then there were numerous servants and employees, each of whom had clearly defined duties. The butler managed the household, the cook was responsible for food, the baker for bread, the stable boy for horses, laundresses, cleaners, maids kept order. A special group consisted of artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, seamstresses, who provided the castle with everything necessary. Everyone knew their place in this rigid structure, and any deviation from the prescribed norms or duties could lead to severe punishment, from a fine to a public flogging. The daily schedule was strict and repeated day after day, like the beating of a castle's heart. It started very early, often with the first rays of the sun, and sometimes even earlier, especially for those who were on duty. The day was scheduled literally by the hour to make the most of each light hour. Remember that artificial lighting was expensive, dim, and a fire hazard. Early morning, the day began with a mandatory prayer for all castle residents, regardless of their status. This was followed by a modest breakfast, usually simple porridge cooked over water or ale, and a piece of bread. Morning. Immediately after breakfast, active work began. For the soldiers, it was grueling training, patrolling walls and towers, cleaning weapons and armor. The servants began cleaning up, preparing for the next meal, dinner. Artisans were engaged in their own guild work. The blacksmith forged, the carpenter built, the seamstress sewed. The lord held audiences, received petitioners, held court, and managed vast estates. Midday or early afternoon, it was time for the main meal, lunch. It was most plentiful and usually hot, with a main course of meat or fish if available. Afternoon, work continued. For the nobility, this could be a time for hunting, both for leisure and for obtaining provisions, administrative affairs, or discussing political issues. The garrison continued to serve. Evening, followed by dinner, which was much lighter than lunch. After that, it was time for socializing, telling stories and ballads, sometimes playing games, chess for the nobles, dice for the commoners, and, of course, evening prayers. After sunset, life in the castle gradually died down. The gates were locked at night, and extra guards were posted. Most people went to bed to save expensive light and heat, as well as recuperate for a new day. Any violation of the schedule or deviation from the hierarchy could have serious consequences. With constant threats and limited resources, discipline was the key to survival. In the event of an attack or siege, this rigid system became vital. Everyone knew their position, their duties, and acted as part of a single, well-established mechanism. The survival of the entire castle, its ability to resist the enemy and internal challenges, depended on the coherence of this anthill. Warwick Castle, with its well-preserved buildings, provides an excellent insight into how different economic zones and spaces for different classes could have been organized, emphasizing this strict hierarchy. Imagine you live side by side with hundreds of people, subject to the strictest regime, without the right to personal space or spontaneity. What was it like? This was not freedom, but survival, organized to the smallest detail. But if every day was so strictly scheduled, how did people find time for at least some entertainment or relaxation? And what if these amusements were far more bizarre than you might imagine? In our world filled with music, podcasts, and endless information noise, it is difficult to imagine life in a medieval castle where almost absolute silence reigned, broken only by the sounds of everyday life and nature. It was a kind of zone of silence, which dramatically affected the leisure and mental state of the inhabitants. The stone walls, thick and massive, effectively extinguished sounds from outside and inside. The rooms were often very quiet, except for the crackling of the fire, footsteps on the thatched floor, and the occasional conversation. This lack of constant background noise, which we are used to, could be both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it promoted concentration. On the other, increased the feeling of isolation and monotony. Entertainment in the castle was extremely limited and depended on social status. For the nobility, these could be music and singing. Bards, minstrels, and troubadours were often invited to the castle for entertainment. They could play lutes, harps, and flutes, board games, checkers, chess, although they were only available to the very rich. Backgammon, dice. These games were popular among both nobles and commoners. Reading, available only to the literate. The books were handwritten, incredibly expensive, and rare. Reading aloud was a common pastime. Short stories and ballads. It was one of the main ways of transmitting information and entertainment. People gathered around the hearth and shared stories of heroes, adventures, and gossip and news. Hunting, mainly for the nobility, but also for the garrison, as a way of getting food and training. Training and tournaments. For knights and soldiers, it was both fun and a mandatory part of the service. For most of the castle's inhabitants, especially the servants and soldiers, the entertainment was even more simple. Card games and dice, simple gambling games that often led to quarrels, singing and dancing. During holidays or free time, people could sing folk songs and dance. Physical competitions, wrestling, tug of war, knife throwing. Heavy drinking, ale and cider were often plentiful, and this was the most affordable way to relax. The lack of constant stimuli and entertainment led to monotony and boredom, which could affect mental health. Superstition flourished in these conditions because the lack of light and sound easily gave rise to fears and beliefs in ghosts. Castles such as Warwick Castle or Beaumaris Castle, with their massive walls and interior spaces, were ideal zones of silence. Imagine, no smartphones, televisions, or radios, just you, a few other people, and constant silence. It seems like going crazy was a piece of cake. But how did they deal with this pressure when there were so few incentives around? The answer lies in unexpected ways of communicating and transmitting information. In a medieval castle, food was not just a source of survival, but also a powerful symbol of social status and power. What you ate, where you ate, and with whom you ate determined your position in the rigid castle hierarchy. This castle snobbery around food was a source of constant friction and even conflict. The Lord's table was the center of the castle world. It served the best and rarest dishes, fresh meat, game, beef, pork, expensive fish, white bread, delicious sauces, fruit, often imported, spices from distant lands, and of course, wine. The Lord's feasts were carefully choreographed performances designed to impress guests and showcase his wealth and influence. Knights and guests of honor sat at the Lord's table in order of seniority, closer to the host. This was a great honor. Farther away from the main table, on the lower benches, sat lesser guests, squires, and then senior servants. Their food was simpler, but still decent. Porridges, soups, bread, and sometimes meat. The farther away from the Lord, the simpler and more modest the food became. The less meat there was, and the more grains and root vegetables there were. In the farthest part of the hall, and often even in the kitchen or in the service rooms, soldiers, lower servants, and servants ate. Their diet consisted of coarse bread, thick stews of legumes and cereals, salted fish or dried meat, if they were lucky. They saw little fresh meat, and the wine was replaced with ale or cider. The difference in quality and quantity of food was huge and reminded everyone of their place in the social ladder every day. This gastronomic divide not only supported the hierarchy, but could also be a source of envy, discontent, and even rebellion. Lack of food, especially during a siege or unfair distribution, could lead to hunger riots among the garrison or servants. The Lord had to make sure that everyone got enough food to survive in order to maintain order and loyalty. Historical records, such as the household books of large estates and castles, show detailed lists of products and their distribution, confirming this strict hierarchy. Zomach Lismore Castle in Ireland, owned by the Dukes of Devonshire, had extensive records of food supplies that allow us to reconstruct the diet of various groups of its inhabitants. Imagine, you work hard all day, you see the Lord enjoying delicious dishes, and you get only a thin porridge. It was a constant reminder of your low status and a powerful psychological survival factor. And how did they, poor devils, cope with boring, monotonous food in order to somehow diversify their diet? We'll talk about this later. If the modern castle surprises us with its cold and damp atmosphere, then the medieval castle was also a sound box, where terrible acoustics reigned. The lack of noise-absorbing materials, huge stone spaces, and high ceilings turned ordinary conversations into booming echoes, making communication difficult and affecting the perception of sounds. The thick stone walls and floors, the lack of carpets, upholstered furniture and curtains, except for tapestries in the chambers of the nobility, all this created ideal conditions for echoes. In a large hall, for example, any loud sound, whether speech or music, bounced off the surfaces, creating a booming, unintelligible echo. To be heard, you had to speak very loudly, shout, or use special techniques. This was especially true during feasts or court sessions, when dozens of people were trying to speak at the same time. The voice of the Lord of Judgment could be lost in the noise. The spiral staircases in the towers were also a kind of resonators. Footsteps, voices, and the clatter of weapons were all amplified many times, creating a sense of constant movement and noise, even if there were few sources. This might be useful for the guards, allowing them to hear someone approaching, but for the denizens, it was a constant annoyance. Imagine that you are trying to conduct an important conversation in a huge, empty hall, where every word turns into an unintelligible hum. This made communication difficult, led to misunderstandings, and required special oratory skills from those who wanted to be heard. On the other hand, this feature was used for defensive purposes. In some castles, such as Pembroke Castle, there are whispering galleries or special niches where even a quiet whisper can be transmitted for a considerable distance along the curved walls. This could be used for secret communications or for eavesdropping. Perhaps it was because of the poor acoustics that loud, bass instruments, such as drums or bagpipes, as well as the shrill voices of singers, were so popular. Only they could break through the echoing castle walls. This also explains why many medieval records contain few long, detailed dialogues. Perhaps they simply weren't possible under normal circumstances. The castle was not a place for intimate conversations, but rather for loud orders and brief messages. How then did people communicate, transmit news, and maintain some sort of connection when words were lost in stone mazes? Find out in the next section how they dealt with this problem. A medieval castle was not just a collection of rooms, but a complex, frequently changing maze full of hidden passages, secret staircases, traps, and secret doors. These elements were vital for surviving a siege, for keeping the Lord and his family safe, and for carrying out covert operations. The castle was literally a living mechanism that could turn into both a rescue and a deadly trap. Secret passages could lead from the Lord's private chambers to distant towers, escape gates, or secret storerooms. Their existence was kept a closely guarded secret, and only a select few knew about them. These passageways were often narrow, dark, and low-ceilinged, designed to allow a single person to move quickly and stealthily. Their entrance could have been disguised as an ordinary wall, fireplace, or even a bookcase, although this is more likely to refer to later periods. For example, in Kreuzberg Castle in Germany, there are legends about such secret paths that led to the river. Hidden staircases, often built into the thickness of walls or hidden behind tapestries, made it possible to quickly move between floors, avoiding the large hall or main corridors. This was convenient for the servants, but it could also be used by the Lord to quickly retreat or make a sudden appearance in the right place. Traps were an integral part of castle defenses. In addition to the obvious moats and drawbridges, there may have been pit traps, hidden trap doors in the floor leading to deep holes with stakes or simply to dark, inaccessible basements, falling grids, portcullis traps, metal bars that could be suddenly lowered, cutting off the attacker's path or locking them in a narrow passageway. Machicolations, holes in the floor above the entrances through which it was possible to pour boiling pitch, water, throw stones at the attackers' heads. These elements were part of psychological warfare. The enemy who broke in had to be constantly wary of the unknown. Every corridor, every door could be a deadly threat. The workers who built these secret elements were chosen with great care, and often their fate after the completion of the work was unenviable. They could be isolated or even eliminated in order to preserve the secret. For example, in some castles, such as Killingworth Castle, there is evidence of extremely complex and camouflaged dungeon entrances that would be virtually invisible to outsiders. The castle was a living, breathing mechanism capable of both protecting its inhabitants and becoming a death trap for those who did not know its secrets. Survival in such a castle required not only strength and courage, but also a deep knowledge of its architectural secrets, which gave an advantage. But if the castle was so full of secrets and dangers, how did people manage not just to survive, but also to maintain at least some order and justice in it, without turning it into an arena of constant conflicts? Living in a medieval castle was not only a struggle against cold and hunger, but also a constant struggle for order and justice. In the absence of a centralized legal system, the lord of the castle was both judge, prosecutor, and executioner. His court was the highest authority, and decisions were made quickly, often based on personal authority and intuition. This was justice on the edge, where the survival of the community depended on strict rules and their strict compliance. Court sessions, if you can call them that, often took place right in the great hall of the castle. The lord sat on a dais, surrounded by his advisors. The charges could be anything from theft and fighting to treason and murder. The evidence was oral, the evidence was often circumstantial, and there was no presumption of innocence. The punishments were extremely harsh and revealing to serve as a lesson for everyone. Fines for minor offenses, monetary fines, or a requirement to work a certain number of days could be imposed. Corporal punishment, flogging, branding, cutting off the ears or nose for theft or other crimes. These were injuries that made a person an outcast. Prison sentence. The castle has always had a dungeon, often located in the basement or in one of the towers. For example, the dungeon in Rochester Castle was famous for its creepy dungeons. The conditions in the prisons were appalling. Cold, damp, hunger, and disease. Many did not survive. Capital punishment. For serious crimes such as murder, treason, and grand theft, the death penalty was applied. It could be public, often by hanging or beheading, to intimidate potential criminals. An example is the system of justice that was practiced in royal castles, for example, in the Tower of London, which was not only a fortress and residence, but also a famous prison and place of execution. Here, under the king's rule, justice was administered in its harshest form. Sometimes trials of God, trial by ordeal, were used to find out the truth. Testing with boiling water, if the hand heals innocent. Red-hot iron, if there are no burns, or even duels. The result of these tests was considered the will of God. Such a system of justice, although it seemed barbaric to us today, was an effective tool for maintaining order in the castle and in the surrounding lands. In the absence of the police and the legislature, fear of the Lord and his sentence was the main deterrent. It wasn't just justice, it was another way for the entire community to survive ensuring its integrity and security. Imagine this. Your life is entirely in the hands of one person, and their decision can be final and merciless. This caused people to be extremely careful and obedient. The medieval castle, as we saw, was not a fairy tale palace, but a harsh, full of dangers and hardships environment. Its stone walls, designed to protect, often became a source of cold and disease. His greatness made him uncomfortable, and his safety made him isolated. Survival within these walls was a daily challenge, a real mystery that every inhabitant had to solve. People survived not because of luxury, but in spite of its absence. They survived because of their ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability. They learned how to fight drafts with heavy tapestries, how to keep warm in each other's cold rooms, how to turn a meager meal into a source of energy, and how to make darkness a part of their daily routine. It was a life full of compromises, but also full of power. The story of survival in medieval castles is a reminder that behind the majestic facades of history, everyday life of ordinary people is always hidden, with their fears, hopes, and little tricks. This is a story about how a real fortress is not a stone or towers, but a human spirit that can withstand any, even the most unbearable conditions. If you were interested in this journey into the harsh reality of a medieval castle, and you want to learn more about how people really lived in the past, please like and subscribe to our channel.